Baking soda and baking powder are two chemical leaveners that we use to help cakes and cookies and quick breads rise, but they're not the same thing. In this lesson, we're going to learn the difference between the two, when to use one over the other, and how to substitute one for the other. Let's start talking about baking soda. Baking soda is also known as bicarbonate of soda or sodium bicarbonate, and it is a chemical leavener. When mixed with a liquid acid, baking soda creates carbon dioxide. What we see that as are bubbles. Those bubbles rise and expand when they get hot, and that causes our cakes and cookies and quick breads to rise nicely, giving us the texture we're looking for. Examples of acids that baking soda would be mixed with would be things like buttermilk or yogurt, perhaps some lemon juice or even vinegar. These are acids that have moisture that activate baking soda, but there are other ingredients as well in baking that are acidic, like brown sugar, honey, molasses, even cocoa powder, as long as it's not Dutch processed cocoa powder. So recipes that have an acidic ingredient, those are the recipes that generally use baking soda. And a general rule would be about 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda for every 1 cup of flour that's in a recipe. It is important, however, that the baking soda be in balance with that acidic ingredient in the recipe along with it. If it's not, if you have too much baking soda, you can get a slight metallic taste. So it is important to pay attention to how much baking soda and how much acid exists in a recipe. You can't just add more baking soda and expect your cake to rise higher. Baking powder is similar but different from baking soda. Baking powder is made up of baking soda and a dry acid like cream of tartar, and then an inert stabilizer, something like cornstarch. This inert stabilizer just means that the baking soda and the cream of tartar are not going to interact with each other. Then, when you add liquid to the baking powder, that's when that acid and the soda start to react together, again forming carbon dioxide. So, with baking soda, you need to add a liquid acid. With baking powder, you only need to add liquid because it already has the acidic component in the cream of tartar. Now, most baking powder containers will have 2 words on there that are very important. Double acting. Double acting baking powder means that there are 2 incidents where carbon dioxide is formed, causing those bubbles that helps our cakes, cookies, cupcakes, and quick breads rise. First of all, it's going to react when it meets liquid. That liquid will activate the acid, the baking soda that's in the baking powder. Then it reacts again when it goes into your oven and gets hot. So double acting. First when you add the liquid, second when you put it into the oven. So when do you use one over the other? Well, first of all, always follow the recipe because they probably know why they've used baking soda or baking powder. But in reality, if there are acidic ingredients in the recipe, that's when baking soda will be used. Because remember, baking soda needs liquid and an acid in order to be able to activate and form that carbon dioxide. If there are no acidic ingredients in the recipe, like sugar cookies for example, you're probably going to use baking powder because that has the acid already built in. Now sometimes you'll see both called for in a recipe, and the reasons there are either there's not enough baking soda to help the volume of the product rise, so the baking powder is called in to help, or perhaps you're making a recipe like buttermilk waffles where you want there to be a little bit of tang. You can't add a lot more baking soda because that will neutralize that acidic tang and you won't get the flavor you want. So baking powder is called in to help. You'll also find that color and texture and flavor are affected by these 2 ingredients as well. Remember, too much baking soda has a metallic taste. Too much baking powder has a bit of a bitter taste. Also, baking soda helps things color. For instance, pretzels are soaked in a baking soda solution to help them brown in the oven. So here's the big question. Can you substitute one for the other? Well, the short answer is no. But let me give you a little bit of leeway there. If it's 11 o'clock at night and you can't get out to get the ingredient that you're missing, you can substitute one for the other within reason, with the understanding that you may also affect the texture, flavor, and color of the baked good. If you're without baking soda, it's important to know that baking soda is 3 to 4 times stronger than baking powder. So Missing a teaspoon of baking soda, you're going to add 3 to 4 teaspoons of baking powder to compensate. If you're without baking powder, it's a little trickier because what you need when you add baking soda to make things rise is also an acid. So if there's no acidic ingredient in the recipe, you're going to need to add that in order to make sure that this baking soda activates. The easiest way to do that is to make your own baking powder. Use 1 teaspoon of baking soda and 2 teaspoons of cream of tartar. Mix those together and then use that as your baking powder. 1 tablespoon of baking powder equals 1 teaspoon of baking soda and 2 teaspoons of cream of tartar. But who's going to remember that? So don't worry, take a look at the chart at the bottom of this article on BlueJeanChef.com and you'll see a chart there that explains how to substitute baking soda and baking powder and what other ingredients you might need to add as well. As with all ingredients, it's important to know how to store your baking soda and baking powder. Baking powder, it comes in an airtight container almost all the time, but it does have a tendency to expire before your baking soda. It's a good idea to check the bottom of the can for the expiration date and make sure you buy the smaller can more often rather than a big batch of baking powder which could go bad on you. Baking soda comes in a box like this that actually has a flap that opens up. It's not airtight. And as you might know, baking soda is really good at absorbing odors. If you leave your baking soda in the cabinet like this, it's also going to absorb odors, which is not ideal when you're using it in your baked goods. So instead, always store your baking soda in a plastic bag that has an airtight seal. Now, as I mentioned before, both baking soda and baking powder can expire. So how do you know if your baking soda and powder are still active? Very easy. There's a test that you can do, and you should do it before you start baking so that you know you're going to be successful. With baking soda, the first thing you're going to do is take about half a teaspoon of the baking soda and mix it with some acid. So in this case, I'm just going to use some vinegar, about 3 tablespoons of vinegar. And what you should see is exactly that bubbling vigorously. Those are the bubbles that we want to see in our baked goods that cause the baked good to rise. When you want to test your baking powder, remember it already has an acidic component, so all you have to do is add some hot water. Take about a half a teaspoon of baking powder and then add that hot water, and you should still see that bubbling. Remember, baking soda is 3 to 4 times stronger than baking powder, so you're not going to see as much activity from your baking powder, but we can see here that that's completely active. In contrast, here is some baking powder that is old, expired, and frankly, very dead. This is what it would look like if you were to test dead baking powder. Very little happening. The baking powder is hardly even being absorbed by the water, and bubbles are minimal. So that's really all you need to know about baking powder and baking soda. In summary, they're both chemical leaveners that help your cakes and cookies rise. Baking soda always needs the addition of a liquid acid, whereas double-acting baking powder already contains the acid, so it just needs liquid, and then it acts again when it gets hot into the oven. You can't really substitute these 2 ingredients, but if you do want to, check out the chart on BlueJeanChef.com or at the bottom of the article for some helpful tips. That's it for this lesson. If you enjoy these lessons and you'd like to learn more about baking or other cooking techniques, make sure you check out all the videos on BlueJeanChef.com.